Hi, this is Father Bill W. I am an Episcopal priest living here in Austin, Texas, and have had the gift of sobriety since December 27th of 1972. So I'm working into my 50th year of recovery, and it's been quite a journey. Those of you who've listened to the podcast know that when I was about 20 years sober, I took a real turn in my recovery and started diving into the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. And then over the years have kind of blended that with a study of the psychology of Alcoholics Anonymous as well. And in my old age now, I'm just trying to kind of blend those two together. So these podcasts are an attempt to give you some of the history, some of the early history, the pioneer program that AA's worked, which was deeply, deeply spiritual, and then an understanding of some of the psychology that underlies the transformation process, the change process that addicts have to go through if they want to really enjoy the fruits of recovery. So we've got a podcast today that's going to start looking at transformation. And if you've listened to me before, you know that I find Carl Jung really, really important in AA history and in understanding the psychology that I was talking about a little bit earlier. Um, he's mentioned in the big book, of course, in chapter 2, where he sends his patient, Roland Hazard, in search of a psychic change. And it's really a change in consciousness that he sends him searching for. And there's a quote in the big book that really got my attention. Maybe it did yours as well. That Roland at first got sober, but then he quickly relapsed. And when he comes back to Jung, Jung says this to him. He says, quote, "You have the mind of a chronic alcoholic. I've never seen one single case recover where that state of mind existed to the extent that it does in you," unquote. See, I think some people in recovery can work some steps, can work kind of a basic program, and maybe not drink, maybe not drug, but for those of us who require a little more in-depth work, that kind of a solution is not going to be satisfactory. So we've got to go deeper with the program, deeper with the steps, and deeper on the spiritual journey. So here's Jung sending his patient in search of this change. As most of you know, that's exactly what Roland experienced. He joined the Oxford group, started doing some in-depth work, and experienced that kind of a change. And so it's always fascinated me. What is this change? What is this psychic change? This um, emotional rearrangement, it's called in the big book. You know, when you're first starting out, these words don't make a lot of sense. But after you, I guess in my case, after having traveled this journey for quite a while now, it makes absolute sense that this is the key to not just to not drinking, but to having satisfactory, enjoyable recovery. That's a real joy that makes even all the pain that we went through worth the admission price. So Jung plays an important role in AA. I did at the beginning. I've done some podcasts looking at the relationship between Jung and AA, the correspondence that Bill Wilson did in writing to Jung to express his gratitude for this. But so how do you start? I guess my question is how do you really start digging into into Carl Jung? I get that question from listeners from time to time. And the only thing I can tell you is Jung is a little bit difficult, maybe a whole lot difficult. He's a scientist. He's a brilliant, brilliant man. And to tackle Jung just from his works, it's kind of like the series we did just recently on William James, that some of us find William James's work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he's tackling some of these issues, to be very difficult. So if you can find a book that explains it in language that you can begin to understand, then I think it may open up the journey of transformation more widely to people. And that's what I've always tried to be about, is trying to break down some of the complex issues in recovery, so that people can get access to them, gain access to them. And a writer who really helped me in doing this and understanding Jung was a fellow by the name of Robert A. Johnson. And he studied under Jung, has written a number of books. They tend to be very simple books, but deep books. They're short, most of them under 100 pages. But he tries to capture the essence of some of the rich language and concepts that Jung expressed through his writings. And so I'm going to do something a little different this time in this series. I want to take Johnson's book. It's titled Transformation: Understanding the Three Levels of Masculine Consciousness. Now, don't let that throw you. And we get a lot of women who listen to these podcasts, and I don't think it's going to be terribly different for a woman to understand it, but it is the title that it is, and in some ways there is a difference between masculine psychology and feminine psychology, which does not always equate to a difference between men and women. You know, we're both made up of two sides, the feminine and the masculine. Again, one of those concepts that's a little hard to understand in the beginning. But anyway, so this book, Transformation, I want to go through it. I've probably read it 10, 12 times. I keep going back to it because it takes me deeper and deeper into an understanding of my own consciousness. And what I've read about consciousness is, we're never going to understand it fully, because it's like a fish trying to understand water. You're just in it. You're experiencing it. So how can you experience it at levels, perhaps, that you can appreciate, understand, and grow beyond? I mean, that's kind of the key, to grow beyond them, to know where you are, know that you're stuck, know that there's a place I'm moving towards, and then begin that spiritual journey that we are on. So I'm going to read more than I usually do on a podcast like this, but the book is short. I'm not going to read it all, but I am going to kind of go into the introduction, and then I'll make some comments along the way, particularly as they relate to people in 12-step recovery. So the book, Transformation. Johnson starts off saying, tradition indicates that three levels of consciousness are available to us: simple consciousness, not often seen in our modern technological world; complex consciousness, the usual state of educated Western man; and an enlightened state of consciousness, known only to a very few individuals, which is the culmination of human evolution and can be attained only by highly motivated people after much work and training. I had a sponsor who used to say, most of the people he knew in recovery had what he called them having undergone a limited conversion. He said, Bill, most people you're going to meet in AA will have a limited conversion. They will have gotten some of this thing, but they will not have gotten all. And I think he was right that there's a percentage of the population in any spiritual practice, and AA is a spiritual practice, for the folks who've gone really deep, who've undergone a transformation. And there are many who are kind of stuck, having experienced some of it, um, but certainly not all of it. And I guess we can each get stuck along the line. I don't know that it's that you get a stamp on your head saying you're enlightened, um, but if you've done the work, you will know what Johnson is talking about in this process. So let's have him explain it a little bit more. Proverbs in many languages point out these three levels of consciousness. One story, for instance, relates that the simple man comes home in the evening wondering what's for dinner. The complex man comes home pondering the imponderables of fate. And the enlightened man comes home wondering what's for dinner. Simple man and enlightened man have much in common, including a direct, uncomplicated view of life. And so they react in similar ways. The only true difference between them is that the enlightened man is conscious of his condition, while the simple man is not. Complex man, on the other hand, spends much of his time worrying and often is in a state of anxiety. I think we see this at meetings. Some of the wise old men and women who have gone through the journey, and we're just starting off, and we're stuck. We're stuck in what Johnson would call complex consciousness, and we long for maybe the simpler consciousness that we used to have. Back when life was just fun and drinking was just a ball. But you can't go back. That's the message of consciousness, that once you've changed, once you've progressed to a certain level, you can't go home again. He goes on, our biblical traditions take us from simple perfection of the Garden of Eden through every imaginable chaos and leads us finally to the heavenly Jerusalem. So again, three levels of consciousness: Garden of Eden consciousness, conflict and turmoil consciousness, New Jerusalem consciousness. Our psychological traditions also validate the existence of three levels. Fritz Kunkel, a psychotherapist in the 30s to 50s, observed that human beings proceed from red-blooded to pale-blooded to gold-blooded consciousness. You see, from red-blooded, the instincts, the vitality, the youth, the simplicity, to pale-blooded, where I start to lose contact with that world that gives me strength and vitality. I lose connection with it, see? And then to gold-blooded consciousness. And that is once I have regained that connection to that world. But I do it as a mature individual, not as a regressive kind of thing. Johnson says this was his simple way of describing the three levels of consciousness open to us. Dr. Esther Harding was one of the first female psychiatrists in the United States who had studied under Jung. Harding has pointed out that psychic energy can manifest itself in three ways: as instinct, that's that raw, rough stuff deep down inside us. And Wilson talks about that as ego consciousness, and that's the stuck part, and as investment in the self with a capital S. Just going to, Johnson will describe it. He says, man evolves from acting instinctively to putting his psychic energy under the control of his ego. And this is part of the evolution. This is part of growing up, that I've got this instinctive energy and this instinctive vitality that goes along with it, but then that goes under the control of the ego. And then he must evolve further to place his psychic energy under the control of the self with a capital S. That higher consciousness is variously called God, enlightenment, satori, or samadhi. That's the altered state of consciousness. That's the evolution that we should go through in growing up, but not many people do it. Again, back to my first sponsor, he said, Bill, we've got a real advantage over these earth people. If we don't do it, we die. And so you better work at it, where other people can just kind of live on the surface of life. You and I have got to dive into the deeper elements of life, or we're not going to make it. And I took him very seriously, because I think he was right. Johnson says, one looks in vain for examples of the man of simple consciousness in our complex Western world. We often project this quality onto dark-skinned minorities and women, and then resent them for it. Writing of his experience at Walden Pond, Thoreau chronicles a complex man's attempts to regain the simplicity of his life. Our own counterculture movement of the 60s was an attempt to restore contact with Mother Earth and natural living. We lose our connection to life. We lose our connection, our groundedness, and we become neurotic and lost and terrified because what? We don't know who the hell we are. We don't know who the hell we are. And you start really digging into the symptoms that underlie our drinking. We try to go back to the last place of security we found. And for me, last place of security I found was not feeling, getting drunk, getting stoned, not doing life felt better than the life that I was stuck in. All right. So that's the complex, and trying to get back to the simple, but it doesn't work. Talks about India a lot. Robert Johnson does. India profoundly affected him in many, many ways. And he says this. He said, when I first went to India, I had been warned of the horrors I would encounter: lepers, corpses on the street, poverty, maimed children, and beggars. All of this was true, and I withstood the impact of the darkness as best I could. I had not been warned, however, of the great happiness of the people. When I saw people who had so little to be happy about living in an unshakable happiness, I was completely thrown. I was witnessing the miracle of simple man finding happiness in a rich inner world, not in the pursuit of some desired goal. I went to India a few years back, only for a couple of days, but I experienced exactly what Johnson is talking about. It was a religious feast when we landed in Mumbai, and the people were out in the streets, and they were happy and they were joyous, and the unbelievable poverty and filth that was all around me I mean, it was a contrast that I have never forgotten and never will. Johnson says, later, I inquired into the origin of the word happy and found that it derives from the verb to happen. In other words, happiness is to be found simply from observing what happens. If you cannot be happy at the prospect of lunch, you are not likely to find happiness anywhere. What happens is happiness. Big book, spiritual axiom. Anytime I'm disturbed, there's something wrong with me. Something doesn't fit. It's not the way I want it to be. That's the stuckness of three-dimensional consciousness. Simple man lives in this consciousness and finds happiness in a rich inner world, no matter what the outer circumstances may be. Men of enlightened consciousness know this noble fact and live in a philosophy and an attitude of happiness. For them, happiness bridges the inner world and objective fact, a connection that simple man is not capable of making. And now what Johnson is going to do is kind of study three cases from literature that have something to teach us about each of these different levels of consciousness. So he says, Don Quixote, who will be the carrier of simple man in our inquiry, knows the colorful world of his inner life, his imagination, but he knows it at the expense of outer fact and reality. This way of life is rich and highly durable, but it requires a superior man to maintain it in the face of outer reality. So this simple man is living in direct relationship with the inner world, but at the expense of outer reality. Okay, complex man, lost to the simple attitude of happiness and not yet understanding that God is what is. Let me read that again. Complex man, lost to the simple attitude of happiness and not yet understanding that God is what is, remains stranded in his worry, loneliness, and anxiety. A Hindu teacher once told me that the highest form of worship is simply to be happy. This happiness is known only to simple men and enlightened ones. Complex man, in between in consciousness, remains trapped by nostalgia for the past or anticipation of the future that mostly eludes his grasp. We look at our consciousness. Is it drifting back to the past, shame, guilt, or nostalgia? Let me get back to what I was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Can't do it. Guilt, shame, or regressive immaturity. That's one direction. The other direction going forward is fear, anxiety. I'll never get there. I can't get there. And the now becomes that painful place in between. Well, what you're trying to do in this is to expand the consciousness of now, that God is what is, that God is to be found in the immediacy of now, not in the future, not in the past, but in the now. And if I can bring my consciousness to that level, I am going to find happiness, joy, peace, serenity, no matter what's coming down. I'm not going to deny that it's painful, but I'm going to be at peace within the pain. All right. Driven from the garden is this little next section. Johnson says, a whole generation of complex men have been thrilled and vicariously nourished by such books as Zorba the Greek, which portrays a wonderful earthy Greek who experienced the vitality of his life in a direct way. I'm going to put an attachment in the show notes to a little YouTube clip. I'd encourage you to go and watch it. It's that scene in Zorba the Greek where Zorba, who is in touch, as Johnson says, with the vitality of life, meets an uptight Englishman who has lost his connection to it. He cannot dance. He cannot experience joy. He cannot experience freedom. And Zorba teaches him to dance. And it's a beautiful, beautiful experience as you watch him. And I encourage you to do that, to watch the stuckness of the Englishman, the uptightness of his level of consciousness, and the level of connection that Zorba has to something beyond himself that he is obviously and evidently in conscious contact with. Goes on, because we have the unjustifiable opinion that complex consciousness is highly desirable, we very carefully educate our young out of their simplicity as early in life as possible. See, they're in touch with it. But parents are very proud if their youngsters can read and write or gain computer skills at a very early age. This often produces children who've been robbed of their childhood and been driven from their Garden of Eden much too early, and who therefore develop neuroses, stuckness later in life. Societies before the modern era and those still functioning in less developed parts of the world believe that most people are to be left permanently in simple consciousness in the Garden of Eden, unless they give solid proof of their ability to make their way through complex consciousness and on to higher consciousness. Thus, only a few very precocious individuals are allowed to acquire complex consciousness. Medieval Catholicism is often accused of trying to keep most of its people in a peasant state and allowing education only to those few destined to sainthood or priesthood. The church censured Galileo not for stating a supposed falsehood, but for speaking the truth to those the church considered unprepared to hear. So Galileo says what? That the earth revolves around the sun. And before that, the belief had been that the sun revolved around the earth, made more sense. So he gets in trouble not for telling the truth, but for disturbing the common mentality, for people who were not ready to hear that. Sometimes I'll hear people say that a guy will say, or a woman, that they went to seminary and they lost their faith. And in many cases, it's true. They lost their faith, but what kind of a faith did they go in there with? It was a naive, a childish faith that needed to be lost. All right. I mean, if you want to become a literalist and a fundamentalist, yes, you can do that, but you're going to do it at a cost, and you're going to pay a price for that. Yes, it's to lose that faith and to gain another faith, a different faith, an enlightened faith, not a fundamentalist one. And I see the same thing happening with the program. We turn it into a religion, and we memorize the lines. And if anyone tries to change them, they're banished to hell. It's just the same process. Eh? So this Garden of Eden theme is important. Jung warns about attempting to go back to it. You can't go back. Once you've left simple consciousness in favor of complex consciousness, you can never regain the simplicity of the peasant or the red-blooded man. Returning to the Garden of Eden is not possible once you've been expelled from it. For as Scripture informs us, there is an angel with a fiery sword standing there to refuse our return. Johnson says, put more simply, you can't go home again. You can't go home again. One of the things when I got sober, almost 50 years ago now, I knew two things of God's will in my life, so clear to me now. One was that God's will for me was that I not drink. I knew that. There's no way in hell I could convince myself that it was God's will that I drink. That was totally my own. And the second was that if I went home, I was going to die. So don't drink and don't go home. And what did going home mean for me? For me, it meant going back to a group of enablers, a family that was riddled with alcoholism, and I would just reassume my position within that family. And they would suck me back into drinking and drugging. That's where almost all of the men in my family were. I had to set out. I don't want to get overly dramatic about it, but I think this is the journey of every alcoholic, that we've got to chart for ourselves a course through life. And you need to know it's not going to be easy. But you don't want to stay stuck, and you can't go home. I'm a big believer in the four absolutes. It's one of the things that the pioneers were really big on: honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. They're what Wilson said he put into steps 6 and 7. But if I ever had a chance to add one to it, the virtue I would add is courage, because I think an alcoholic, an addict, someone who's starting this journey of recovery is going to need that. And that's where I think conscious contact with God at the level of prayer, at the level of two-way prayer, where I'm put in touch with this source of security, of love, of companionship, feeling expelled from the garden. It's God walking with me in this journey. So what Johnson is going to do in this book, and what I'm going to do in this series, is try to explain these three levels of consciousness. The simple level that we can't go back to, the Don Quixote. So next episode we'll look at him and see what he was about and what he was trying to do. And then in the next episode we'll look at an example of complex consciousness, and that is best described in the form of Hamlet. To be or not to be. He was stuck, and he wouldn't make a choice. Wouldn't go this way, wouldn't go that way. Just thought about it. Thought about it to the point where brought chaos to everyone around him. It's a tragedy. And that's the tragedy of addiction, that we stay stuck instead of growing. And then fourth dimensional consciousness, Johnson is going to describe him through Faust, Goethe's Faust. So it says this going to be like going back to high school and maybe taking some of the literature that we read in there and perhaps didn't understand, but now either later in life we can look at it differently, or even if you're early in recovery, you can look at it and understand what it is about your life that you're going through And I think Johnson will be, I hope he will be for you as he has been for me, a companion on that journey, that we find our teachers who can open up the world of spirituality, the world of psychology. And in these days, those two have really blended. That psychology, at least the way Jung practiced it, had everything to do with finding the true self inside. And as the big book would put it, the great reality within. So that's going to be the journey. Uh, uh, I'll put a link where you can get transformation. It's and many of Johnson's books are really solid gold as far as taking these difficult concepts and breaking them down in simple ways. I hope simple ways, that we addicts and alcoholics can understand. So I hope this episode is helpful for you. I hope the series is going to be helpful for you. It's something I've been thinking about doing for a long time, but just didn't have the courage to do. So finally got the courage, and here we are. So hope you'll stay with me. So thank you for listening. God bless, and keep coming back.